Who gets to decide where you belong, your ticket or the color of your skin? The air inside Sacramento International was thick with the low hum of announcements, rolling suitcases, and the quiet tension that often settles before takeoff. But none of that touched 10-year-old Kayla Monroe as she sat at gate 34B, feet dangling from the hard airport chair, her small fingers gripping a faded book about galaxies and stars, a gift from her father when she was 5. It was a reminder that her dreams had no ceiling, and today, those dreams were stretching their wings. She had just wrapped up 2 intense weeks at a space science camp, the kind most kids only hear about on TV. For Kayla, a bright-eyed black girl with boundless curiosity and an imagination that often carried her beyond Earth's orbit, it had been a dream come true. Her mind was still filled with the sound of rocket launches, experiments with dry ice, and late-night stargazing that made her believe anything was possible. But what made this day even more extraordinary was what waited ahead. Her very first flight in first class. A golden boarding pass, carefully tucked into her pocket, shimmered like a secret medal of honor. Her father, Marcus Monroe, had saved for it, planned for it, not because he believed in spoiling his daughter, but because he believed in rewarding perseverance. "You worked hard, sweetheart," he had said the night before. "This is yours." Marcus wasn't famous, but in boardrooms his name carried weight. A regional executive for a major tech firm, he had fought his way up from the very edges of opportunity to sit at the table with those who once doubted him. People in his office called him Chief Marcus. But to Kayla, he was just Dad. The man who fixed her model rockets, explained constellations, and reminded her daily that she was powerful. When the gate agent finally called first-class boarding, Kayla's heart kicked like a drum. She adjusted the straps on her galaxy-printed backpack and stood up, clutching her pass as if it might vanish if she blinked. Walking past the long line of passengers in general boarding, she felt the curious gazes, some kind, some puzzled, some questioning. But she kept moving, head high, just like her dad had taught her. Her seat, 2A, felt like stepping into another world. The leather was soft and warm, the window perfectly round, and the blanket folded like a promise. Kayla pressed her hand into the cushion, eyes wide with wonder. The airport workers loading baggage below looked like miniature figurines from up here. She pulled her book out, nestled it in the seat pocket, and leaned her head against the cool glass, a quiet smile curving her lip. She didn't know, couldn't have known, that just a few rows away, a storm was already forming. That in minutes, her excitement would be replaced with confusion, shame, and the kind of silent resistance that shifts fault lines. It began with a voice too sweet to trust. A flight attendant, Heather, in her mid-40s with a polished bun and a rehearsed smile, leaned down beside Kayla. "Hey there, sweetheart," she said, her tone dripping with forced cheer. "Mind being a big helper today?" Kayla blinked. Her hands went still. Heather continued, her head tilted. "We have a very special guest who needs a bit more room. Would you mind switching to a different seat? We'll find you a nice spot further back." It was said like a suggestion. It was meant as a command. And in that moment, everything changed. But that's just the beginning. Before we dive deeper into this powerful, real-life story, take a moment for yourself. Find a quiet space. Pour a glass of water. Get comfortable. This isn't just a story about a seat on a plane. It's about dignity, about power, about the right to say, "I belong here." So settle in, because what happened next will stay with you long after the seatbelt sign fades. The hum of the cabin was steady, almost hypnotic, a soft soundtrack of clicking seatbelts, overhead compartments shutting, and murmurs of early conversations as passengers filtered in. But none of that registered for Kayla Monroe. The 10-year-old sat quietly in seat 2A, her fingers still tracing slow, invisible circles on the window. Outside, airport workers in neon vests zipped between carts and containers, and above them, jets taxied in and out like metal whales. She could see her reflection in the glass, a girl with wide eyes, shoulders held high, trying her best not to look too amazed, too small, or too alone. The smell of leather and citrus-scented cleaner drifted around her. The leather seat cradled her frame like it was molded for her. For the briefest moment, everything felt exactly right. A place earned, a seat rightfully hers. She hugged her book to her chest and leaned her head back, letting herself exhale. Then came the heels. Sharp, clicking footsteps echoed up the aisle, measured, confident, mechanical. Kayla didn't look up at first. It was just another crew member passing through, she thought. But the sound slowed, paused, and then stopped beside her. The soft shuffle of a uniform skirt. A perfectly pressed blue blazer entered the corner of her vision. She looked up. Heather. The flight attendant's smile was already in place, pristine and polished. Her lipstick was the kind of red that belonged in a painting. Her eyes, however, were unreadable, too still. "Hey there, sweetheart," Heather cooed, her tone just above a whisper. "You're Kayla, right?" Kayla blinked and nodded. She sat up a little straighter, instinctively adjusting her seatbelt like she'd done something wrong. Her fingers clutched the edges of her book. Heather crouched slightly, resting her manicured hand on the edge of Kayla's seat. Her perfume smelled like cold flowers. "We have a very special passenger today, a guest who's had a long journey and really needs some extra space to stretch out," she said with a rehearsed softness, tilting her head like a porcelain doll. "Would you mind switching seats just this once? We can find you a nice spot a few rows back." The words hung in the air, silky and deceptive, like wrapping paper around a stone. Kayla felt the temperature in her body shift. Her ears buzzed faintly. "My dad got me this seat," she said, trying to keep her voice from cracking. "He said it was special." Heather's smile twitched. Just a flicker at the corners, but never fully broke. Of course he did," she said with a syrupy nod. "And you're such a smart, brave girl, too. That's why I know you understand how helpful this would be. Just for today." Kayla shook her head gently. "I really want to stay here." For a beat, Heather didn't respond. The smile remained, but something behind it shifted. The softness in her tone vanished, like mist. She stood up slowly, brushing invisible lint from her blazer. "Well," she said, voice tight, "I'll be right back." Kayla's heart thumped. Her cheeks were hot. She stared down at her lap, unable to meet the eyes of the other first-class passengers who now seemed to be watching. She was still the only child, still the only black passenger in the row. She hadn't imagined it. She was being singled out. Was it because she was a kid? Because she was young? Or was it something else? The whisper of injustice slithered into her gut. She tried to focus on her book, but the words danced. She looked out the window again, but the workers no longer looked like moving parts of a grand airport ballet. They looked distant, indifferent. She wasn't sure what to do with her hands. Then the footsteps returned, 2 sets this time. Heather was back, and beside her stood a man, tall, thin, late 40s perhaps, dressed in a navy blue suit that looked like it came with a manual. His smile was tighter than Heather's, and it didn't try to be warm. He crouched slightly, a motion that felt more calculated than kind. "Miss Monroe, we're hoping you'll reconsider," he said evenly. "We'd be happy to make sure you still receive the same first-class service. We just need you to relocate to a seat that's a little more appropriate." As appropriate. The words scratched at her like sandpaper. Kayla gripped the edge of her seat, her knuckles pale. "I don't want to move. My dad said I earned this." Heather stepped in again. Her voice was lower this time, almost a whisper. "Most of the time, first class is reserved for adults, honey. You'd be more comfortable with other kids." Kayla blinked. Other kids? She'd walked past every row. There were no other kids. There was no kids section. This wasn't about comfort. This wasn't about helping. This was about erasing. She swallowed hard, unsure whether the sting in her eyes was fear or fury. The suited man's eyes flicked toward Heather, then back to Kayla. "If you're not able to move on your own," he said calmly, "we'll have to reseat you ourselves to avoid delays." Kayla froze. It wasn't a request anymore. It was a warning. The book on her lap now felt like a shield, paper thin. She reached slowly, discreetly, for the pocket where her phone was tucked. Her fingers trembled. Her throat ached. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure someone could hear. She found the last message from her dad. Her thumbs shook as she typed. "Daddy, help, they want my seat. Won't leave me alone." She hit send and waited. The phone screen dimmed, but the tremble in Kayla's hands remained. She tucked the device back into her pocket, folding her arms tightly across her chest like she could hold herself together if she just pressed hard enough. The suited man and Heather stepped away again, their heads bent in close conversation, hushed tones crackling with tension. But Kayla didn't move. She couldn't. Each breath felt heavier now, her chest rising and falling with the effort of restraint. The knot in her stomach tightened as murmurs began to rise around her. Not from the crew, from the passengers, from the witnesses. 2 rows behind, a woman in a beige cardigan leaned toward her seatmate. "Why are they asking the kid to move?" she whispered, not as quietly as she thought. A man across the aisle glanced up from his newspaper, eyebrows drawn. The air shifted. Tension isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the sudden absence of casual chatter. Sometimes it's the way eyes linger, the way silence begins to swell in places that had just been filled with light conversation. Kayla's phone buzzed once. Text from Dad, "Stay calm, do not move. I'm handling it." Then another ping. Text from Dad, "Do they know who you are yet?" "They're about to." Kayla stared at the words, her breath catching in her throat. What did he mean? She didn't know, but she trusted him. She slid the phone back beneath her thigh and looked straight ahead, eyes open, shoulders square. She wasn't going anywhere. Minutes passed. Then something began to crack. Heather reappeared, but this time the crispness in her walk was gone. Her hands fidgeted with the edge of her jacket. She whispered something to a new crew member Kayla hadn't seen before, who nodded and walked with purpose toward the cockpit. Then came the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be experiencing a slight delay as we finalize pre-fleet procedures. Thank you for your patience." Kayla didn't blink. The man in the suit walked by again, but this time, he didn't look at her. Another buzz. Text from Dad. "COO has been informed. You're no longer just a passenger." She wasn't sure what COO stood for, but she knew it meant power. She could feel it, in the way people started watching more openly, in the way another flight attendant hurried back down the aisle and whispered something that made the man in the suit go pale. Kayla didn't smile. She didn't shift. She simply waited. Then came the image that seared itself into every witness's memory. Heather, the suited man, and 2 other crew members quietly collecting their things. Wordlessly, stiffly, one by one, they walked off the plane. The doors shut behind them with a final, echoing click. Kayla let her head rest against the seat again. Not a grin, just a breath. A quiet girl in her rightful seat. And far beyond that airplane door, something had changed forever. The plane's wheels touched down with a gentle thud, the familiar jolt signaling the end of a journey. But for Kayla, the 10-year-old girl who had faced an unexpected trial in the skies, this was more than just the conclusion of a flight. It was the beginning of a new chapter. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, Kayla sat quietly in her first-class seat, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap. The events that had unfolded during the flight played over in her mind like a movie reel. The confrontation, the unwavering stance she took, and the eventual departure of the crew members who had tried to displace her. She had stood her ground, and now she was returning home, with a story that would resonate far beyond the confines of the airplane cabin. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers began to gather their belongings. Kayla remained seated, her eyes fixed on the window, watching the bustling activity on the tarmac. A flight attendant approached her, a new one with a warm smile and kind eyes. "Miss Kayla, your father is waiting just beyond the gate," she said gently. "Would you like me to accompany you?" Kayla nodded, her voice caught in her throat. She gathered her backpack, the weight of her experiences heavier than the bag itself, and followed the attendant down the aisle. As she stepped off the plane and into the terminal, the noise and movement of the airport seemed to fade away. There, standing amidst the crowd, was her father, James. His tall frame was a beacon of comfort, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on her. In that moment, time seemed to stand still. Kayla dropped her backpack and ran into his open arms, the world around them disappearing. He held her tightly, his embrace a fortress against the chaos of the world. "I'm so proud of you," he whispered into her hair. "You stood up for yourself, and you didn't back down." Kayla pulled back slightly to look into his eyes. "I was scared," she admitted, "but I remembered what you always tell me, that I belong and I have the right to be where I am." James smiled, his eyes glistening with tears. "And you proved that to everyone." They walked together through the terminal, hand in hand, the weight of the experience settling into a shared understanding. As they exited the airport, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the city. It felt symbolic, as if the world was acknowledging the end of one chapter and the start of another. In the days that followed, Kayla's story spread like wildfire. Passengers who had witnessed the incident shared their accounts on social media, news outlets picked up the story, and discussions about discrimination and the importance of standing up for oneself filled the airwaves. Kayla, however, remained grounded. She returned to her routine, attending school, spending time with friends, and dreaming about the stars. But she also understood that her actions had sparked a conversation, one that was necessary and long overdue. One evening, as she sat with her father watching the news, a segment about her experience aired. The anchor spoke about the bravery of a young girl who refused to be silenced, who stood her ground in the face of adversity. James turned to her, his expression serious. "You know, Kayla, not everyone has the courage to do what you did. You've inspired so many people." Kayla looked down, her fingers tracing patterns on the couch cushion. "I didn't do it to inspire anyone. I just wanted to sit in the seat we paid for." "And that's exactly why it's so powerful," James said. "Because you didn't do it for recognition. You did it because it was right." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words settling between them. Then Kayla spoke. "Dad, do you think things will change?" James considered her question. "Change is slow, but every action, every voice contributes to it. You've added your voice to the chorus calling for justice. That's how change begins." Kayla nodded, a sense of purpose filling her. She didn't set out to be a symbol, but if her experience could help others find their voice, then it was worth it. As the night wore on, Kayla went to bed, the events of the past few days swirling in her mind. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew she wasn't alone. With her father's support and the strength she found within herself, she was ready to face whatever came next. The next morning broke softly, light spilling like honey across the windowsill in Kayla Monroe's room. Outside, the world continued its usual rhythm. Buses sighed, birds argued from rooftop branches, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked half-heartedly into the sunrise. But inside her room, time felt like it had paused, cradled in the quiet aftershock of something enormous. Kayla sat cross-legged on her bed, still wearing her oversized Space Camp t-shirt, hair puffed into a soft halo of morning curls. Her phone buzzed faintly on the nightstand. Another notification, then another and another. The world hadn't gone back to normal. In fact, it had just begun to pay attention. James Monroe, her father, stepped into the doorway, holding 2 mugs of cocoa, the steam curling upward like delicate whispers. One had a chip on the rim, the one Kayla always chose. "She's on the front page," he said gently, handing the mug to her. His voice carried the awe of a man who'd seen battles, but never like this. "They're calling you the girl who wouldn't move." Kayla blinked. "Front page?" James nodded, then handed her the tablet he'd tucked under his arm. The screen lit up to an article. Bold letters splashed across the headline. She stood her ground. "Airline under fire after young passenger denied first-class seat." Underneath, a grainy photo taken from someone's phone on the flight showed Kayla in her window seat. Back straight, face calm, framed by the leather of 2A and the tension in the air. More than 30,000 shares, thousands of comments. "Is this really happening?" she whispered. "Kayla already did," James said, "and now people are talking." Kayla's throat tightened. She had imagined a return to her books, her rocket models, to blending in, but now she was a spark in dry grass. The ripples were spreading. Later that day, Kayla and James went for a walk to the bookstore downtown. They kept their heads down, tried to blend in, but the moment they stepped inside, the silence hit. A woman near the register gasped. "Oh my God," she whispered to her coworker. "That's her. That's the girl from the plane." People turned. A slow, reverent kind of hush fell over the room. And then, applause. It started from a man near the back who rose from his reading chair and clapped once, then again, slowly. Others followed, not loud, not showy, but sure, solid, like rain on a roof. Kayla gripped her father's hand. James leaned in and whispered, "Hold your head high, baby. This isn't noise. This is respect." They walked through the aisles like a procession, people nodding, smiling, offering words Kayla could barely absorb. She reminded us, we can say no. My daughter needed this story. She's braver than most grown-ups I know. It was surreal, overwhelming, a tide of emotions that threatened to carry her off her feet, but in the middle of that storm of recognition, Kayla stayed anchored. Later that night, after dinner, James brought home a small box with a bow. Not fancy, just paper and string. Inside was a pen. "Not just any pen," he said. "This is the one I signed my first executive contract with. I want you to have it." Kayla traced her fingers over the metal, smooth and cool. Why? James sat beside her on the couch, their knees touching. "Because your words matter now," he said. "They always did. But now people are listening. One day you're going to write something, maybe a speech, maybe a law, maybe a story that helps someone else hold their ground." Kayla looked up, her voice soft. "Even if I'm scared?" James smiled. "Especially when you're scared." And then he hugged her, not as a child, but as a force. The next morning, a teacher from Kayla's school called. Would she be willing to speak at Monday's assembly? Just a few words about what happened. About courage. About voice. Kayla hesitated. Her stomach twisted. But she heard her father's voice echo inside her, especially when you're scared. So she said yes. That night, she sat at her desk with the pen in hand, staring at the blank paper. The streetlights painted gold stripes on the floor. She could hear the ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator down the hall. And then, slowly, she began to write. "My name is Kayla Monroe. I didn't want to become a story. I just wanted to sit in the seat my dad gave me because I earned it. But sometimes the world doesn't recognize your worth until you show it. You won't move." Her handwriting was uneven, her words simple, but they were hers, and they were enough. The auditorium was filled with a hum, low, restless, expectant. Rows of students shuffled in their seats, whispering, laughing, glancing at the stage with curiosity and something close to awe. There was a buzz in the air that didn't quite have a name, but everyone could feel it, like the air before a storm or the moment before a rocket lifts off. It was Monday morning, and the entire school had gathered for an assembly. The lights dimmed slightly as Principal Holloway walked onto the stage with her usual calm but firm presence. She smiled and raised a hand for silence, though she hardly needed to. "We have a special guest this morning," she said, her voice clear and warm. "One of our own. Someone who recently reminded the entire country what courage looks like, even when you're only 10 years old." A pause. Then she turned toward the curtain. "Kayla Monroe, would you join us?" The silence cracked open with the sound of applause. Not forced, not polite, but rising from the students like a wave they couldn't hold back. As Kayla stepped out from behind the curtain, a soft gasp fluttered through the crowd. She wore a plain navy dress, her braids pulled back neatly, a silver pin on her collar shaped like a tiny rocket. She looked smaller than they expected, but somehow taller too. With slow, deliberate steps, she walked to the podium. Her hands gripped the speech she had written the night before with her father's pen. Her fingers shook a little, but her shoulders were squared. She looked out over the crowd, not just at the front row, but all the way to the bleachers in the back. And then she began. "My name is Kayla Monroe," she said, her voice clear, soft, but steady. "I didn't want to become a story. I didn't ask to be in the news. I just wanted to sit in the seat my dad gave me because I earned it, because I belong." She paused. The room didn't even breathe. Sometimes, she continued, the world doesn't see you, or worse, it sees you and pretends you're not enough. She took a breath, her fingers unclenched from the paper. That day on the plane, I felt small, like maybe I should just move to make everyone else more comfortable. But then I remembered something my dad always says. He says, "When you've worked for your place, don't you dare shrink to make others feel taller." She looked down for a moment, then back up. I stayed in my seat, not to be a hero, but because it was mine, because I deserved to be there. And I want every one of you to know, you deserve your place too. No matter your size or skin or silence. A breath caught in the back row. "Courage," she said, "isn't loud. It's not always fists and fire. Sometimes it's just not moving, even when your whole body wants to disappear." Someone sniffled. She lifted her chin. "So if one day someone tells you to move because you're too different, too young, too soft, remember this. You don't have to be loud to take up space. You don't have to shout to be heard." And then the line that silenced the last whisper. "Sometimes the quietest voices echo the farthest." The room was still. Then the clapping began. It started like a single raindrop on a roof, then another, until it was a downpour. Students stood, teachers stood. The custodian in the corner dabbed his eyes with a paper towel. James, who had watched from the wings, put his hand over his heart. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Kayla stepped down from the podium, and as she passed the front row, a girl with freckles reached out and touched her arm. "You made me feel brave," she said. Kayla nodded, her eyes warm. "You already were." The applause from the school assembly didn't end at the doors of the auditorium. It followed Kayla Monroe down the halls that Monday morning, soft, silent echoes in the way people looked at her now. No one pointed, no one stared, but when Kayla passed, heads tilted slightly, eyes softened, shoulders straightened. It wasn't celebrity. It was recognition, respect, reverence, for something far bigger than a headline or a viral clip. It was the quiet awe reserved for people who've been through fire and still walk forward. And Kayla walked forward. That afternoon, when Kayla returned home, a package sat waiting on the porch. Brown paper, no return address. Her name written carefully in black ink, Miss Kayla Monroe. She and her father brought it inside and opened it on the kitchen counter. Nestled inside was a sleek, navy glue folder and a single sheet of thick, cream-colored stationery. At the top, in embossed lettering, Office of the Secretary of Education. Kayla stared. James unfolded the letter and read aloud. "Dear Miss Monroe, your courage has become a lesson far beyond the walls of your school. You have reminded us all that dignity doesn't come from age or size, but from the strength to stand still when everything tries to move you. With your permission, we would like to include your story in our national curriculum on civic courage and student rights. Generations will learn from your voice. With admiration, the Secretary of Education." James's voice caught on that last word, admiration. He looked down at his daughter. Her eyes were wide but quiet, still taking it in. And then she did something unexpected. She walked over to the wall next to the fridge, where a printout of a galaxy hung, a poster from her first day at space camp. Without a word, she taped the letter next to it. Stars and strength, side by side. That night, the phone rang off the hook. News stations, civil rights groups, teachers from other states, everyone wanted to talk to Kayla. But she didn't want to talk. Not yet. Not in that way. Instead, she pulled her dad's old jacket from the closet, the one he wore to job interviews, slightly too big for her shoulders, and went out onto the back porch with a flashlight and her journal. It was time to write again. She sat beneath the wide California sky, stars pricking through the dark like quiet witnesses. Her flashlight flickered across the page as she scribbled. Bravery isn't something you wear. It's something you do when no one is looking. When the plane is quiet, when your throat is tight, when you're told to go, and you stay. She paused, listened to the night breathe. I didn't know what would happen when I said no. I didn't even say it loudly, but saying no was the loudest thing I've ever done. The next morning, James found her asleep on the porch swing, her journal resting on her chest, the flashlight flickering beside her. He didn't wake her. He just covered her with a blanket. That afternoon, Kayla returned to school to find the library windows covered in handmade signs. You belong here. Kayla equals courage. Our voice, our seat. Each one drawn by classmates. Some messy, some misspelled, all beautiful. Inside the library, her teacher, Miss Carter, greeted her with a smile and a gift. A hardcover book, Hidden Figures. Inside the front cover was a note. To Kayla, may your mind always reach the stars, and may your voice never forget the sky it rose from. Ms. Carter knelt to Kayla's level and whispered, "You've given them more than you know, especially the quiet ones." Kayla hugged the book to her chest, and for a moment, her eyes stung, but she didn't cry. She just nodded and whispered, "I was one of them." The first time Kayla Monroe saw herself on television, she was sitting on the couch with her legs tucked beneath her and a half-eaten peanut butter sandwich in her hand. The footage rolled slowly, a montage of headlines, news clips, phone recordings from passengers, and still photos from the flight. But what caught her off guard wasn't seeing herself. It was hearing the voices. Stood her ground. 10-year-old refused to move. Became a national conversation. They were talking about her. Not just her face, her choice, her voice, her stillness. James sat beside her, one arm stretched along the back of the couch, the other resting over her shoulder. He said nothing. He just watched her watching herself. And when the anchor said her name, crisp and proud, Kayla Monroe, a student from Sacramento, he gently squeezed her arm. Kayla didn't blink, didn't flinch, but she felt it. She felt the weight of something shifting again. Later that evening, after the clip had aired, after the texts from cousins and classmates had quieted, after the last reheat of leftovers had been cleaned off their plates, Kayla opened her laptop. She didn't go to her email, or her games, or even her journal. She opened a blank document. For a while, the screen stared back at her, empty and expectant. Then, slowly, she typed, "What does it mean to belong?" She stared at the sentence, her fingers hovering above the keys. Is it just a seat on a plane, a name on a list? Or is it something you carry with you, even when others try to take it away? She paused, then added, "Maybe belonging isn't about being accepted. Maybe it's about knowing you deserve to be exactly where you are, even when no one claps for you." She saved the file and titled it "My Seat." The next day, when she walked into class, something strange happened. Her classmates didn't swarm her, didn't crowd her with questions or comments. Instead, they parted around her like water around a rock. She didn't feel like a star. She felt like a compass, like someone others were quietly reorienting themselves around. And Kayla noticed something new. The girl who always whispered during roll call, she raised her hand in science class. The boy who never looked up from his desk, he asked to borrow Kayla's pencil. The kid who always got picked last in PE, he ran first that day. Kayla's seat had turned into something else, a signal, not just a moment of resistance, but a reminder. You're allowed to take up space. You're allowed to be seen. That afternoon, after school, James drove her to the neighborhood park. Not for a media interview, not for a speech, just to swing. The wind rushed past her ears as she pumped her legs, higher and higher, until the sky blurred and the trees swayed below like shadows. She closed her eyes, let go of the ropes for just a second, and felt the drop in her stomach. The beautiful, terrifying fall before the swing caught her again. James stood nearby, watching. When she finally slowed down and dragged her feet through the sand, he walked over and said, "You know, I used to swing right here when I was your age." Kayla looked up. "Did you feel brave back then?" James smiled. "I didn't even know what brave meant. I just knew what scared felt like." Kayla was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked, "Do you think I made a difference?" Her father didn't answer right away. He walked to the swing next to her and sat down. "Let me ask you something," he said. "What happens when one bird changes direction in a flock?" Kayla thought. "The whole flock moves." James nodded. "That's what you did." She looked down at her sneakers, then back at the sky, then whispered, "I'm still scared sometimes." James reached out and took her hand. "That's what makes your courage real." The first time Kayla Monroe was invited to speak publicly after her story swept the nation, it wasn't in front of flashing cameras or a crowd of politicians. It wasn't even on a stage. It was in a place far quieter, a community center in Oakland with chipped paint on the walls, folding chairs lined up in uneven rows, and a hand-painted banner above the door that read, "Youth Voices Matter." James drove her there in silence. The highway hummed beneath them like a long, slow heartbeat. In the passenger seat, Kayla looked out at the world flying by, storefronts, telephone poles, a man holding a sign that simply read, "Notice me." That one stuck with her. The event was small, 30 people, maybe less, mostly students, some teachers, a few parents sitting stiff in plastic chairs. The energy in the room was not the electric buzz of media hype. It was something heavier, a quiet gravity. These were kids who knew what it felt like to be told, "Not here, not now, not you." When Kayla stepped up to the podium, a music stand with Scotch tape holding it steady, she didn't read from a speech. She didn't open her notebook or quote the letter from the Secretary of Education. She just looked out at them, then said, "I didn't say anything fancy on that plane. I just stayed where I belonged." There was silence. Then movement slight but visible. A girl in the second row pulled her hoodie down. A boy in the back who hadn't looked up once all afternoon raised his head, just slightly. Kayla continued, voice low but clear. "I wasn't trying to make news. I wasn't trying to start anything, but I learned something that day. When you don't move, sometimes the world has to." And then she paused. She could have ended there. But her heart beat louder than her fear. So she added, "Some of you feel invisible. I did too. But you're not. You're not. And if nobody else says it, I will. You matter. You're enough. You belong." A sharp breath echoed from the corner of the room. One teacher clutched their hands together. One student closed their eyes like those words had been waiting years to land. After the event, a girl named Destiny came up to her, 14, braids like hers, quiet eyes. "I wanted to leave school last week," Destiny said. "I felt like nobody cared if I showed up or not." Kayla didn't say, "I understand." She didn't say, "I've been there." She just reached out and hugged her. Tight. Real. Later that night, back at home, James found her in the backyard again, this time not with her journal, but a paintbrush. She was kneeling in front of the old wooden fence, painting words across the panels. They read, "You don't need permission to belong." She turned to her dad, cheeks smudged with blue paint. "I want people to see it every time they pass." James stepped forward and dipped his thumb into the paint, then pressed it against the wood, leaving a fingerprint next to her message. "That's how we leave marks," he said. "Not loud, but lasting." It began with no headlines, no cameras. Just Kayla Monroe sitting beside her father on the back porch, their chairs creaking in rhythm with the evening breeze. The light was soft, the world unhurried. No speeches, no stage, just two hands, one large, one small, resting side by side on the worn wood railing. In that silence, something unspoken healed. Not everything, not all at once, but enough to breathe easier, enough to begin again. From that quiet space, ripples would continue to form. New policies were written, crew members were held accountable, schools started new conversations about belonging, and perhaps most importantly, Kayla's courage whispered to thousands of others, "You are not invisible, and you are not alone." Because what this story has always been about, beneath the headlines and applause, is not just defiance, it's not fame, it's restoration, a restoration of dignity, of safety, of the rightful place each person holds in this shared world, especially those too often asked to move. The real lesson of Kayla's seed. Sometimes the strongest thing we can do is stay, not stay in anger, not stay to fight, but stay to affirm, I have a right to be here. For older generations who have seen progress come and go like tides, Kayla's story may feel familiar. You've likely sat in your own seat, on buses, in waiting rooms, at tables where you weren't always welcomed. What her story reminds us is that the quiet act of staying is an inheritance. It's the strength you've passed on, and now it's rising again, in new voices, new generations. This isn't about making noise. It's about making room for justice, for dignity, for one another. If this story moved you, we invite you to help it continue. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, Racist Stories, and share this video with someone you love. Every time you share a story like Kayla's, you help build a world where every voice counts and every seat is honored. With warmth, thank you for joining us. We hope you'll stay with us on this journey, here, where real stories are heard. Welcome to Racist Stories.